What's up, everyone? Welcome to Bilbrons and Dragons. I'm your host, Bilbron Bafflestone. So today we're doing a rating and ranking of the 18 different skills that you can get in 5th edition. Skills are pretty important, and PCs typically only get 4 to 5 of them, so knowing which ones are going to come up more often and which have more impact is important to character creation. Now, of course, your mileage may vary based on your Dungeon Master and on your table, but having played at a pretty wide variety of tables and having brought in the folks in my Patreon and having done my research and gone out on the web to see what others have had to say, I think I've come up with a pretty good list. So let's jump into this and see what we've got. So I've gone ahead and abandoned my personal rating system and gone to the default system used by the gaming community with the SClass at the top and A, B, C, and D below that. And within a tier, the skills listed first will be considered to be rated higher. We start with the SClass, which I consider to be skills that are almost constantly useful, in large part because these are the skills that come up in terms of combat. Combat is the most important pillar of the game, so unsurprisingly, the skills that have combat impact are more powerful. At the very top, we have Perception, a wisdom-based skill that is probably the most invoked skill in 5th edition. It's amazing on every build. It is constantly used in the combat and exploration pillars, specifically to defeat enemy stealth rolls. Stealth is one of the most powerful mechanics in 5th edition. It gains surprise rounds, which you certainly don't want to experience. It's used to notice traps and secret doors and clues, so I hope it's not too much of a surprise that Perception is the most important skill of the game. And then the flip side of Perception is the second most powerful skill in the game, the Stealth skill. Based in Dexterity, it's also good on every build. This is how you gain surprise, right? Perception is how you defeat surprise. Stealth is how you gain it. It's also critical for a lot of builds. Being hidden from your opponents is tremendously tactically useful. They can't target you. You can gain advantage on your attacks. And so even though it's probably the most incorrectly applied mechanic in 5th edition, regardless of how it's ruled, Stealth and Perception are both very, very important. The final skill in the S-Class is Athletics. Based in Strength, it's a critical skill for martials because it's used to initiate, resist, and escape grapples. Now, it's also often invoked by the DM during the exploration phase. A lot of times there are strength-based skills involved where athletics is the role. You use it for climbing stuff. And while you're only supposed to be using athletics rolls for difficult climbs, a lot of times the DM has you use it for every climb. So athletics is very important. And that's why these 3 skills are the S-Class, because they have a huge impact in combat. Next, we have the A-Class, which is useful in most sessions. And we're going to lead off with Persuasion, a charisma-based skill that is the primary skill invoked when you're having the interaction phase, right? You can also use Deception or Intimidation, but you usually lead with Persuasion. You typically lead with honey and not vinegar, in large part because there's the least penalty for failure relative to Deception or Intimidation. If you fail your Persuasion check, you can still recover, but failing a Deception or Intimidation check can often have very negative consequences. Next up, we have Insight, a wisdom-based skill that is often invoked in interactions. Typically, it contests deception. And quite frankly, I think that it should be used in almost every interaction. I mean, it's one of those things that is constantly being used, so much so that I think passive insight actually makes a lot of sense. Not really a thing in the books, but it was popularized by Critical Role, and I think it makes sense. Insight's very important. I think DMs should be asking for this check more than they typically do. And finally, rounding out the A-Class, we have Arcana, the intelligence-based skill that covers spells, magic items, eldritch symbols, magical traditions, planes of existence, and certain creatures, including aberrations, constructs, elementals, fae, and monstrosities. That's a pretty killer list, right? You're very often going to be asked to roll about those sorts of things, which just come up all the time in 5th edition. And it also has certain game mechanics attached to it. It's used to identify spells, often in conjunction with counterspell. And while rules as written, both of these take your reaction, so you're supposed to be counterspelling blind. In my experience, most tables house rule otherwise. They either directly allow you to do both, or they allow one PC to identify it and kind of call it out for another one to counterspell, right? There's always usually some kind of workaround so that they can know the spell, and that requires Arcana. It's also used to detect and disarm magical traps. It's critical for Mitzium apparatus builds, which is a very cool item that calls for Arcana rolls. And most importantly, it's necessary to scribe scrolls and to scribe spells into a wizard's spellbook from a scroll. Scrolls are very powerful when affordable, and scribing them yourself makes them very affordable. So Arcana is a very important skill. It rounds out the A class. Next we have the B class, which have mechanics that can be built around. They're not going to come up all that often, but you can build around them. We lead with Investigation, an intelligence-based skill that covers traps, ciphers, riddles, and gadgetry. Now, in my experience, Investigation comes up fairly frequently in the exploration phase. Anytime you're trying to investigate a scene or figure out a mystery or find clues, I often have to roll for Investigation. It's also supposed to be invoked when you're figuring out how to disable traps, although in my experience, a lot of DMs kind of skip that step and just go right to the Thieves' Tool check. But rules as written, it's supposed to require both an Investigation and a Thieves' Tools check. It's also used to see through illusions. And personally, I think DMs should be using Passive Investigation a lot more to automatically bypass illusions. Passive Investigation is actually officially a thing. It's part of the Observant feat. And so I don't think you should have to ask to see through illusions. I think that's something that your Passive Investigation should do for you. It's also used to detect some spells. For example, Glyph of Warding or the Symbol spell are noticed by Investigation. And there's some overlap with Perception. So in some cases, I've found that a character that has a high Investigation but a low Perception can sometimes talk the DM into using Investigation instead. Next up, we have Deception, a charisma-based skill that's fairly often invoked in the interaction phase. Not as much as Persuasion, but often enough, especially by certain types of PCs that like to fool folks. It's used with disguises, for example, the Disguise Kit, or the Disguise Self spell, or Alter Self. And while it does have a higher penalty for failure than with Persuasion, it still comes up fairly frequently, if you choose to invoke it a lot, so it makes the B class. Similarly, it's followed by Intimidation, the other charisma-based skill that is used in interactions. If you're that sort of PC, you can invoke it often, and while it has the biggest penalty for failure relative to Persuasion or Deception, I also think it's a lot of fun. I personally use Intimidation on one of my favorite PCs. He has Expertise and Cloak of Flies to get advantage on it. And so I really like that interaction with Cloak of Flies advantage and Expertise and Infernal Calling, so I can get my White Abishai out there. And it can also sometimes be used in combat. Like, if the outcome isn't in doubt, sometimes I've found the DM will allow you to roleplay an Intimidation attempt, and then they'll, run away or surrender, and that way you don't have to use up slots or whatever to put them away. And I've also found that a lot of DMs will allow characters to roll it with Strength instead of Charisma. So if you're one of those big, beefy martial types but has dumped Charisma, you can still sometimes get away with a good Intimidation check at a lot of tables. Rounding out the B class, we have Acrobatics, a dexterity-based skill that is pretty strong in role-playing sense. I mean, it just belongs on certain character concepts, right? And the DM will often default to it for dexterity-based physical things. And it does have a combat application in that it can be used to resist or escape grapples. Not initiate them, but to resist or escape them. So it's a decent one to add to builds that dump strength, but keep a decent dex for medium armor, which is a lot of builds. And it is used to determine if someone falls when jumping in difficult terrain. See my short video that I did on parkour that talks a little bit more about that. Some niche uses to acrobatics, and so that's why it makes the B class. Next up, we have the C class, which are only situationally useful and don't have any mechanics to build around. We lead off with Survival. It can situationally be useful because you use it for tracking. Right? And sometimes you're going to want to track creatures even all the way up to tier 4. And while it can be replicated with some magic, that magic has to be available and prepped, and it costs resources. So sometimes you want to make a survival check, and maybe you roll good, and then you can track the creature. It's also occasionally invoked during the exploration pillar, and can be useful like when rations are being tracked and such like that. But its main use is for tracking things. Next up is Sleight of Hand, a dexterity-based skill that is used when you're trying to be covert, right? You're trying to pick pockets or cheat at cards or whatever. It can be often invoked by a particular type of character, but I found that it's fairly rare that DMs allow it to have a huge impact. And it can be useful with Mage Hand or Telekinesis. And DMs also invoke it sometimes when you're talking about things that require fine control, like tying knots or forging signatures or certain dexterity-based puzzles. So it's not useless. It makes the C-class. And rounding out the C-class, we have Nature, an intelligence-based skill that covers terrain, flora, weather, and certain creatures, including beasts, dragons, oozes, and plants. I found that this is almost never invoked. When it is, it's usually to get unimportant backstory or lore. There's some overlap with survival, so if you have survival, you often don't need Nature. The creatures it covers aren't really hugely useful. Dragons for sure, but beasts rarely have any kind of special abilities, and you don't often run into oozes and plants. However, Nature does have a niche use in that it's used to harvest poisons. A DC 20 Nature check will allow you to harvest most poisons, and poison can be cool, right? If you just killed a purple worm, why not try and get that poison? At least it's something that gives Nature a boost and puts it in the C-class. And finally, we have the D-class, which are rarely relevant. You never really need to get proficiency in these skills. The best of them, I think, is Religion, an intelligence-based skill that covers deities, religious hierarchies and rites, holy symbols, cults, and certain creatures, including celestials, fiends, and undead. Like most of the intelligence skills besides Arcana, it's almost never invoked. It typically is just for backstory or lore, but it does have potentially useful creatures to know about, right? Celestials, fiends, and undead. You might want to know what they can do. Next up, we have History, another intelligence-based skill, this one covering historic events and people, ancient civilizations, wars, and certain creatures, including giants and humanoids. Again, rarely invoked unless the DM wants to give backstory. And knowing about humanoids doesn't usually help you because they don't usually have any special powers, and knowing about giants is pretty niche. Next up, we have Animal Handling, a wisdom-based skill that should technically come into play sometimes when you're dealing with mounts and pets, but in my experience, parties hardly ever mount up. When they do, they typically just do what they're supposed to do, and they're never really hard-pressed and forced to make an animal handling check. In play, the skill is typically replaced by Speak with Animals or with Animal Friendship, so I've just really hardly ever seen animal handling called for or used. Next, we have Performance, a charisma-based skill that is rarely invoked in the interaction phase, and when it does seem appropriate, it is often replaced by a musical instrument check, so you're almost never going to need to roll Performance. And finally, the worst skill in the game is Medicine, a wisdom-based skill that is never used except to stabilize a down ally, and it can fail. So don't do that. Use a 5 gold piece healer's kit, which will do the exact same thing, but never fail. And any skill that can be replaced by a 5 gold piece equipment and better is not very good. That's why it is the worst skill in the game. So yeah, that's my rating of the skills. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And regardless, thank you so much for watching. This has been Bill Bronze and Dragons. I'm your host, Bill Bafflestone. See you next time.